had to say to the multitudes gathered at the River Jordan. This is the time that we focus on the joy of expectation. The joy that parents feel as mother's belly swells, as lives change and bodies change, and we actually see the manifesting of the seed coming into shape, into form, and beginning to take place, take its space in the world. It's time to reach out and to settle into a feeling of joy and expectation. John wouldn't seem to be a great proclaimer of joy because he's got words of warning as well. But the idea is that John is a bit of a transition figure in history. If you go back to Zephaniah, the words of the prophets, they are proclaiming the restoration of Israel as a nation. The history of Israel has been tumultuous. They've lost their homeland many times. They have been a bit of a political football in the Middle East for most of their existence. And it seems at every turn they are always waiting for God to rescue them from one situation or another and to establish them as his chosen people. And so now the time of expectation draws us into a new understanding of what it means to be God's people. The idea that John preaches, is probably best summed up in the verse where he says, "Do not call yourself the people of God." God can make his own people. He can raise people out of the stones. God can make whatever nation he wants to make. And it's not up to you folks. The crucible of becoming the uplifted national, as it were, in their eyes, people of God, has nothing to do with being Israelites. It has nothing to do with being born into an Israelite family. It has to do with how you are born spiritually. The people who have come to hear John are tax collectors, soldiers that was the brood of vipers part, I think, was in John's sermon, was looking straight at those tax collectors and soldiers, and probably some Jewish leaders, and giving them the name he felt they needed to hear. You are a brood of vipers. You are not my people. Why? Because you do not do what I've asked you to do. This is your instruction, and this is how you become my people. It's an interesting verse that he uses. Okay? He talks about them as the acts that befit repentance, that are the fruit of repentance. So, on the one hand, it's one thing to come into a river, to own the salvation of God, to have yourself put under the water and brought up again. But unless you're bearing the fruit of that baptism, God cannot own you. God cannot own you. God cannot claim parenthood of you, cannot claim you as a child if your repentance is words only. So what John is telling the people is that in order to truly be the people of God that Israel proclaims to be, it's not about the family you were born into. It's not about your history back through Jacob and Isaac and Abraham and back to and through Moses. It's where you stand right now in your world. If you have more than enough, share with someone who has nothing. Pretty much everything that Jesus taught. Doing unto others. Giving of what you have. Sharing. Bringing people into a relationship of love with their Creator. And this is the joy that is our invitation. The joy that we are invited to share. John is a proclaimer, but Jesus is the proclaimed. And what John says about him is, he is so much greater than I. I'm not even worthy enough to tie his sandals. He is so much more than I am. And yet, as we hear those words, those of us who have been living in this tradition for most of our lives, if not all, we remember that part of the story where Jesus gets on his knees before his followers and washes their feet. That is Jesus showing us what it means to be the glory of God. It's meant to be, meaning being the servant of all is to be the glory of God. Now, this takes place, the story we read this morning, it's a little out of order in the Christmas story because we're still in that place of anticipation. But this particular story precludes the baptism of Jesus as an adult. So we can go where we want with this part of the story. We've already jumped ahead to Jesus washing the disciples' feet, and now we'll go backwards in time to the fact that Jesus actually came into the earth in a very humble place. His kingship was not announced by palace guards as it is today. His kingship was hailed very much in secrecy. Because when they got to town, there was no place to go. No one was expecting this baby to be born tonight. They had to take shelter in an outbuilding behind an inn, possibly a hewn-out cave, which was often done for farm animals. Was basically a cave out of the rocks with hay and feeding troughs, and simply a place for shelter, a place for feeding. The only people who actually were privy to this were some shepherds out in the fields, a very lowly class of people in that particular social strata, and some mysterious astronomers from Persia, and who had been following a star that had been revealed to them in their astronomical charts. So it's an interesting mix of people that have been invited to this little thing. No soldiers, no royalty. That was it. It was simple, it was humble, it was no more glorified than the birth of any child on that night. And chances are there were a lot of young children born that night, boys and girls, both. So, what we have given to us is that this is our joy. Our joy is not that we have a national pride. It's not to say we don't need to have one, but that's not where our fundamental joy comes from. Our fundamental joy comes from our life in the Spirit. The life that we live in community with one another, whether in the church, whether in another church, a different community, whatever kind of group of people you gather around you to be in study, to be in prayer, to be in meditation, to be in service, whatever that is. I think it's more important now than at any time, at least in my lifetime. And I was born in the 50s. It was post-World War, and yes, at that time we were still rah-rah America because we won. But we've come into a time in our history when there is such a strong sense of nationalism in the United States that it concerns me that it overrides our membership as people of God first. The people who promote nationalism, and it sometimes borders on populism, try to tell us that all we have to do is trust in them to make everything right for us, and to wave our flags, and to make sure that we are better and stronger and more powerful than everyone else on the planet. And life is good. It's good for us. It may not be good for other people, other countries, but that's not really important. It's not really important. If it's all about just making America great again, then we are not following the teachings of Jesus. We are not following the will of God. And we are not being the Christmas people, the children of God, the presence of Spirit on our planet and in the midst of all the people who live thereon. This is the Sunday of joy. We rejoice in God. We rejoice in God's presence within each of us. We rejoice in infinite love and forgiveness, never-ending kindness, understanding, and embrace. It is such a gift to be here. And it's worth sharing with absolutely everyone, no matter where they come from. It's ours to give. It's our joy. And when it spreads out beyond our walls and our hearts, it becomes the joy to the world.